You're watching a riveting global conversation on combating and containing the rise of China. My guests are Kishore Mahbubani, former president of the United Nations Security Council and a leading academician from Singapore, Professor John Mearsheimer, one of the world's leading international relations scholar, and Samir Saran, president of the Observer Research Foundation. Kishore Mahbubani, for reasons that most of us in India can't fathom, you seem to believe that China and India can rise together. The events of the past 2 months are more than ample proof that China is not interested in peaceful coexistence with India. They believe that there can only be one sun that rises in the east, and that is them, and they want India to bow to their might. That is something that 1.3 billion people will never agree with. So is your fundamental premise, Kishore Mahbubani, flawed and been proven to be so?
Thank you. I really appreciate your very blunt questions. And I'm glad you said 2 months. So it's interesting that you are now forecasting the future relationship between China and India, two countries that have been around for 2,000 years at least, on the basis of what happened in the last 2 months. Whereas I would say that a better guide to the future of China-India relations is not what happened in the last 2 months, but what happened in the last 2,000 years. And for most of the past 2,000 years, and this is, by the way, this is not me speaking, this is Jawaharlal Nehru speaking, this is Prime Minister Manmohan speaking, Manmohan Singh, they've always been spoken about the long relationship between China and India. And if you look, for example, at the cultural context between China and India, remember the world's greatest university was in Nalanda in India, and guess who came there? The top Chinese scholars came to study in India. So I would say, yes, you have temper, you always have ups and downs in relations between two countries. But if you look at the longer history between China and India, certainly there's room for hope. But just going back quickly to a point that John Mearsheimer made, he was absolutely right, by the way, when he said that it would be a complete mistake to underestimate the United States. And I have a fictional memo in my book, Has China Won?, where fictionally President Xi Jinping is warned, whatever you do, never underestimate the United States. It's the greatest power that we have ever seen in human history. And I completely agree with John on that. But I also want to emphasize another oldest rule of geopolitics, which I hope my Indian friends are aware of, which is that when great powers act, the primary interest is to protect their own interests and not necessarily their allies or friends' interests. And let me tell you something, since you want to deal with a world that's full of geopolitical surprises, I wouldn't be surprised if 10 years from now, there's some kind of great historical bargain that develops between the United States and China. That is not impossible, let me tell you that. And if something like that happens, guess what? All the allies and friends get ditched in history. And if you want to get examples of that, you can talk to the Shah of Iran and how he was dropped. You can talk to President Mubarak of Egypt and how he was dropped. But that's nothing surprising at all. Allies and friends.
John Mearsheimer,
sensible.
In the first part, you advocated that India and the United States should come closer. That requires India to trust the US more, because if we were to do so, Beijing would very clearly be offended. Kishore Mahbubani makes a very important point about the US having been very selfish in years gone by, at this moment being run by a highly unpredictable president. If India were to come closer to the United States, and later, if there is what Kishore Mahbubani calls a historical bargain with China, that would leave India out in the cold. Is that a risk you think India should consider taking?
Well, I don't believe in concepts like trust. I don't believe that states should trust other states in international politics. What I think India should do and the United States should do is act in their own strategic interest. India should do what's good for India, and the United States should do what's good for the United States. And what's going on here is what's good for India and what's good for the United States is for the two of them to work closely together to deal with a rising China, because China is a threat to the interests of both India and the United States. And it's for that reason that we have had increasingly close relations over the past 2 decades. And it's why I believe our relations will become even closer in the decades ahead. Again, it's in India's interest and it's in America's interest for those two countries to come together. Now, the idea that the United States and China are going to cut a deal in 10 or 15 or 20 years and sell India down the road is, I believe, not realistic. China is likely to continue to rise. It's likely to continue to scare both India and the United States and to drive them together. We're not going to cut a deal with the Chinese because, as Kishore said in the beginning, the Chinese are interested in changing the world, and we, the United States, are interested in making sure that they don't change the world. So we're going to have a fundamentally competitive relationship for as far as the eye can see. And that's going to go to great length to keep India and the United States closely allied. But again, this has nothing to do with trust. I wouldn't place much emphasis at all on the
Samir Saran, there is a very clear confluence between India and the United States at this moment. Would you be afraid about China and the US, as they did some decades ago, working closely together, and that could upset India's equation with China if we've already infuriated the dragon?
Rahul, I think any country that relies on external assistance to respond to its core national security is making a mistake. I think relying on someone else is a mug's game. India has to deal with China on its own. I agree with Kishore that our only obsession has to be build capacity, state capacity, our economy, our military capabilities, our presence in international institutions, and our capacity to shape global discourses and global events. I think that is India's medium-term goal. Now, I completely agree with John that if India was to make a strategic calculus today and it was to assess, is America in relative decline a good bet to make? I think the answer is yes. I think the demise of America is greatly exaggerated. America is not going away anywhere. And at this point of time, like John mentioned, our view of at least the Asian region, if not Eurasia and finally Europe as well, is likely to converge. And in that sense, we could have a greater partnership of equals with the Americans than the Chinese will ever offer us. I just want to again repeat, the Chinese have not indicated any desire over the past decade, and this is not 2 months, so I just wanted to respond to Kishore as well, that it's not a 2-month phenomenon. I think it's a decade-long phenomenon, that Chinese have been seeking to humiliate India into submission in the Asian order. For them, a G2 world where they are the one and America is the two is their endgame. They don't want multipolarity in Asia, and they are not likely to have 16% of humanity agree to that proposition. The Americans are not doing that to you. The American offer is that can we partner together in our common objectives. What are those common objectives? Ours is a positive agenda. That can we create stability? Can we create open seas? Can we create rule of law ecosystems? Can we invest in infrastructure, and can we build renewables, and can we create digital economies that do not serve the interest of a single political party? So I think the American proposition and the Indian assessment coincides deeply. And therefore, I would believe that if the Mandarins in South Bloc and India were to shed their ambiguity and reluctance and inertia and admit to themselves that for the next 7 to 8 years, we are at our vulnerable most vis-a-vis China, simply because of the asymmetry that Kishore outlined. We are a fifth of their size. An American partnership is a good idea.
Okay. And Kishore Mehbubani, 2 months versus several years. The reality is the Chinese don't even want to exchange border maps so that differences can be resolved, because they'd like to keep India off balance. America in relative decline would offer India far more equal terms of engagement than a China which would never want to see an India rise. Respond to the points made by John and Samir.
Well, by the way, I agree with John's realism when he said earlier, international relations is not about trust at all. International relations is about countries taking care of their interests, and I think the United States does a very good calculation of its interests, and the reason why the United States has been the most successful country, I would say, at least over the last 150 years of human history, the United States has by far been the most successful country because it is very, very carefully calculated where its interests lie, and it has pursued them very well, very intelligently, and very successfully. And I would say, and I completely agree with John, that India should do the same calculation, and I would say do a comprehensive calculation. It's not just about the military. I mean, clearly one of the biggest changes the world is going to have to deal with is climate change and global warming, and the question is who pays the bill for global warming? Now, we all know that global warming is happening today not just because of the current new flows of greenhouse gas emissions from the newly emerging countries like China and India. It's because of the stock of greenhouse gas emissions that has been put up by the Western industrial powers, including the United States, over the last 200 years since the Western Industrial Revolution. Now, what's happening is that the Trump administration is now saying, we in America, we're not going to pay a penny at all for any of this cost of greenhouse gas emissions. You, the new countries, you, China and India, you have to pay for it, and we are not going to pay a penny. And it's amazing that the world's richest country, United States, refuses to take under Trump administration any responsibility at all for global warming, and he wants to pass the bill to countries like China, India, and everybody else. So you got to decide then, is that in India's interest then to work with the United States with that kind of calculation? Guess the amount of bill you have to pay. Guess what? As Manmohan Singh said, India will have to stop producing coal-fired stations, and your people will not get electricity. So is that in your national interest? So look at the bigger picture. Look at the whole picture of all the issues, and don't just focus on one thing like the border. It's a much bigger, more complex global game that's been played. And you mentioned 10 years. Can I just remind you that 30 years ago, it was United States, China, and Pakistan were aligned against India and the Soviet Union. I mean, have you forgotten that? But that's also perfectly natural because great powers will go where their interests go, and India has got to decide where its interests lie. And I can assure you that India's interests are best served if you are a strategic, autonomous actor of your own and not necessarily an ally or dependent on everybody else. As Samir has said earlier, and believe me, the whole world would respect India a lot more if India became an independent strategic actor, and you disagree on China on issues where you disagree with them, and you disagree with the United States on issues where you disagree with them.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's anybody in India who'd want for Delhi to become a vassal of Washington. The 1.3 billion. Yeah, go on, Samir.
No, I think the idea that we should not assess what's happening in the border in our strategic calculus of our relationship with China is preposterous. I think sovereignty and territorial integrity is important. I agree with Kishore that should not be something that should lead to a complete breakdown of the relationship, but that is again something that the Chinese need to decide. They are the bigger actor here, and they need to decide whether they are going to allow a greed for land, a medieval urge to influence a relationship that has great potential. Now, I think you're asking the wrong actor here to make that call. That call has to be taken by Beijing, that is beating someone into submission, a great trading negotiating strategy. And I think that is what Beijing is trying to do. Now, as far as the US is concerned, I have absolute agreement with the previous speakers that John, when he says that the strategic assessments converge, the strategic intentions converge, the strategic environment is similar, and therefore a partnership works. In this kind of a relationship, there is no one submitting to the other. You are making independent political choices that happen to converge and reinforce each other's postures. And I think that is very different from being either a vassal or an ally. And I think the second speaker, Kishor's point is also correct. I think India could be creating coalitions where interests converge. And some of those coalitions, provided the Chinese behavior moderates, like, for example, in the case of SDGs and climate change, could include the Chinese as well. Now, I have argued that the Chinese and Indians have lots of similar challenges that Kishore has enumerated in his previous comment. But that is not going to be on the table as long as someone wants to change the map of my country. Now, I think this is of course personal.
Kishore Mehbubani, when you talk about climate change and global warming at a time when China is threatening India's sovereignty, that argument sounds vacuous. Who's interested in global warming when you've got Chinese army amassed against the Indian army on the line of actual control and Chinese soldiers killing Indian soldiers and vice versa? Our first and only interest at this moment is to protect our territorial integrity, and I don't see much hope for a shared economic prosperity when you've got a bloody confrontation taking place.
Your Prime Minister has said that no Indian territory has been taken. And I believe I would listen to what your Prime Minister said.
He also clarified it's about one particular sector that he was speaking about, not about the line of actual control. The government has since clarified that.
Yeah, but and I said at the very beginning that the loss of life is very tragic, and I completely agree that we should find a way of avoiding this for certain, and every country has a right to defend itself. That's obviously that's a no one can argue about that. Absolutely not.
John Mearsheimer, in the few minutes that I have left in this conversation, I want to focus on the best strategy to contain China. Do you think India can, overlooking, as Kishore Mehbubani says, the border problem, look at the net matrix of the entire relationship between India and China? Or do you believe that not just is a clash, an economic clash, a military clash with China inevitable, but it will be core to India's future going forward, and therefore that's the one central question we first need to address?
Well, I think because what's taking place on the border and involves the question of Indian sovereignty, it deals with Indian territory. It's an issue of enormous importance. It's important to understand that anytime two countries have a relationship, there are competitive elements and cooperative elements. What Kishore likes to do is emphasize the cooperative elements and largely ignore the competitive elements. But what we're seeing as China grows more and more powerful is that the competitive elements are becoming more important than the cooperative elements. And I think that's likely to be increasingly the case in the future. And in that circumstance, India has a deep-seated interest in working with other countries to try to contain China, because Chinese expansion is not limited to the India-China border. Look at what's happening in the South China Sea, the East China Sea. So I think it makes very good sense for India not to lose sight of those cooperative dimensions to the relationship with China, but to understand full well that what is most important is the competitive element, because that involves Indian sovereignty.
And the reality also is, with India, the United States, Australia and Japan coming together in a deepening of the quadrilateral arrangement now seeming more and more inevitable, there will be a serious counter to China. And if so many countries across the world, not just Taiwan and Hong Kong, but increasingly countries in East Asia start becoming more and more concerned about China and wary of Chinese products, that then leaves China with a very big market and some weaker countries it can dominate, but a lot of the middle powers, Kishore Mehbubani, would no longer like to do business with China. So maybe the spirit which they've grown in the past won't be the spirit which they'll grow in the future.
Can I just make a small prediction for you?
Go on.
If you're right, we will see. The answer is empirical. This is not a question of opinion. This is a question of facts. So if you're right, and that the East Asian countries are going to cut off their ties with China, then the logical consequence is that there'll be less trade between East Asia and China in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And I can assure you of one thing. I guarantee you that trade is going to increase between China and the rest of East Asia. And I'm glad you mentioned the Quad, because that's a perfect example of how you end up, in a sense, getting into an alliance relationship with other powers, and where other powers will, of course, put their own interests first. And I can tell you, I don't know whether you're observing what's happening between China and Japan. What's interesting is that what a relationship, which, by the way, is a much more painful relationship than the one that China and India have, because, India never occupied China, China never occupied India. But Japan occupied China, as you know, and defeated China several times. So that is a very fraught relationship, and you see a quiet adjustments going on between China and Japan. And in the case of Australia, right, the present government is definitely very, very strongly anti-China, but governments change in Australia, and if a Labour government comes into power in Australia, you'll have a different policy down there. So I would say that, the best advice is for India to look at its own interests and what it can do to protect its own interests. And I can tell you that India, if the more freedom of action you have, the more strategic autonomy you have, the more options you have.
Okay.
That is iron rule of geopolitics. So the best thing for India to do, but my advice is very, very simple. Keep all your options open. Don't close off options. And whoever you think may be your ally today may be someone who will turn against you tomorrow. That is an iron law of history. And even though, John says it is inconceivable that the U.S. and China will come together. Sometimes impossible things like that happen.
Okay.
And then what do you do?
So when you've got somebody across the border with a gun pointed at your forehead, that is one option of friendship which doesn't really count for much. But we've had a fascinating contest of ideas. All of you have so forcefully argued the points that you've written about and spoken about, and we've had a varied exchange here. I want to thank deeply John Mershameyer, Kishore Mehbubani, and Samir Saran for lighting up this global conversation on containing China and the way forward. Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll have more for you on the other side. Stay with us.
Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kanwal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.